Tonight I have for you a spooky collection of camping / hiking stories, mostly hiking stories. And if you can hear in the background, that is thunder, which maybe will add to the ambiance of this story. But for now, prepare yourself, because it's time for another Lithos horror. 3 years ago, my husband, a friend, and I hiked the TCT. One night we camped in this incredible spot in Death Canyon shelf with a massive rock face rising directly behind us. Sometime during the night, a huge thunderstorm rolled in. I've never heard anything like it. The thunder was unbelievably loud. It was echoing off the cliffs of the canyons. Equal parts terrifying and awe-inspiring. I'm a really light sleeper, so I was awake off and on throughout the night. Then it started freezing rain, and eventually that turned to sleet, and it coated the tent and the campsite. Then around 3:30 a.m., while I was fully awake lying there listening to the storm, I heard something I really can't explain. It sounded like a woman singing. Not close enough that I thought someone was standing outside of our tent, but close enough that I could make out a melody. It was haunting, almost mournful, like an old folk song in another language. The next morning, I tried to explain to my husband and our friends, and ended up describing it as a sad yodeling, which sounds ridiculous, but that's honestly the closest comparison I could think of. It was deep and throaty, but it was strangely beautiful. Now I wonder maybe if it sounded something of a traditional or indigenous style singing. But here's the thing that gets me. This was at 3:30 in the morning, during a full-on thunderstorm with sleet coming down. Even if someone had somehow been nearby, which already seems unlikely, they wouldn't exactly be out there singing in the full weather like that, would they? We were far from the trail, and there weren't any occupied sites close to us. It's one of those experiences that really stuck with me. Whenever it comes up with my friend and my husband, I just throw my hands up and say, I swear I know what I heard. I know people might roast me for this, but I'm genuinely curious. Has anyone else had strange or unexperienced experiences while backpacking? I was hiking through the desert one night under mostly a full moon, so everything was surprisingly bright. Then I saw something shaped like a person, but it absolutely wasn't human. It looked like it was wearing a white gown, but it had this faint blue glow around it. Its face was so disturbing that I honestly can't even describe it. Then suddenly it changed. What had looked human turned into a white owl, maybe 3 feet tall, with an unnaturally human-looking face. The thing is, later I found out there isn't even an owl that matches what I saw. Someone later told me that it might have been a screen memory, where your brain supposedly replaces something overwhelming or terrifying with something it can process. I don't know what I saw out there, but it scared me more than almost anything I've ever experienced. It's not exactly the kind of story you tell people, because who would believe that? I probably wouldn't have either if I hadn't seen it for myself. It's one of those things that feels impossible until it happens to you. I tend to be skeptical of most things because I think if you really want to experience something, your mind can fill a lot of it in. I had something happen that I really can't explain. I was hiking in the Absarokas. on a lakeside trail. I was hiking in the Adirondack Mountains on a lakeside trail along the upper Saranac. Nothing unusual, just out for a late walk to catch the sunset while we were still in the area hiking. Marcy and I spending the time around Lake Placid and Saranac Lake. I was alone during this hike. The sun had gone down, but there was just enough light to see. On the way back, I heard splashing out on the lake. It was rhythmic, like puddles or paddles cutting through the water. It sounded like a canoe or a kayak. The trail was about 30 feet from the shoreline. I looked out expecting to see something, but there was no one there. The paddling kept getting closer, almost like multiple boats of people were paddling in sync. Since I couldn't see anything, I walked down to the water's edge. I stood there completely still, staring across the lake. Then the sound paused directly in front of me. Clear as day, paddling, moving by, continuing out across the water. But there was absolutely nothing there. No boat, or people, or even animals. The sound faded as if whatever it was had moved out further into the lake. At that point, I decided I'd had enough and made my way back to the parking lot before it had gotten any darker. I'm sure there'd probably be some explanation. Echoes. They carry some sounds across the water. Something hidden in the light condition. But standing there at the shoreline, hearing something pass by that I couldn't even see was one of the strangest experiences I've ever had. This is definitely the second weirdest thing that's happened to me on a hike. The first, and by far the strangest that's ever happened to me. This story is completely true, and at the time I was scared. It scared the hell out of me. That's probably a normal explanation. Maybe lighting, maybe my brain was filling in gaps. But even now, 5 years later, I still remember it vividly. I grew up in Maryland, which was a great place to get into hiking, climbing, and backpacking. My brother and I used to do the Maryland section of the AT all the time and would make trips up to the Catskills and the Adirondacks whenever we could. There's a spot in Pennsylvania, maybe an hour and a half from home, with a short hike up a rocky outlook above a lake in the surrounding mountains. It's only about a mile to the top, more of a walk than a climb, and we usually just go out to hang out, eat lunch, and enjoy the view. But there's one strange thing about the trail. About 2/3 up, there's this little shrine or memorial. It's a small angel statue, a stone with a Bible verse, and this little bush covered in hair ties, waistbands, and even a pair or two of sunglasses. Trees nearby had crosses spray painted on them. It wasn't threatening, just strange and unsettling. It looked like maybe someone had passed away up there, or someone who loved the trail had been memorialized. The weirdest part was the bush. People clearly left things there, almost like offerings. The first 2 times I visited with a friend, we did the same thing. We left a wristband and kept hiking. The 3rd time I went, I brought my girlfriend, and who will actually become my wife in 2 months. We went up to catch the sunset and take pictures. When we got to the shrine, I told her to leave something. She questioned it a little, but we both kind of felt like we should. She had a hair tie, but wanted to keep it until after the pictures and said she'd leave it on the way back. Fair enough. We went up, watched the sunset, took pictures, and had a great time. Only one other guy had been up there, and he left before us. What neither of us really thought about was hiking back down in the dark. We had no flashlight, just the phone screen lighting the trail. The walk back got quiet. We focused on not tripping, probably tired, and it was just bright enough to make out the outline of trees. Bats were flying overhead and the temperature dropped. At some point, I realized we had already passed the shrine. Oops. I decided not to mention it because that she scares pretty easily, and we were already in the dark woods. Then something happened that I'll probably remember forever. We were walking, and out of nowhere she says, "Hey, are your eyes playing tricks on you?" I had no idea why she asked that. She doesn't remember either. But when she said it, I looked into the trees, and I saw something. About 40 feet off the trail, something was standing in the woods, moving at the exact same pace as us. At first, I tried to explain it. An animal? A shadow? But it wasn't moving like an animal, and there wasn't enough light to make it out any sense of a shadow. My immediate thought was, that's a boy. I watched it for what felt like 10 full seconds while we kept walking. Then it paused behind a tree and never came out on the other side. I stopped dead. The only thing that came out of my mouth was, "Oh." I tried to play it off like I'd noticed the parking lot or something and hurried us back to the car. I didn't tell her what I saw until we were already on the highway. She said she hadn't seen anything and thought maybe it was my shadow. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was a deer, weird lighting, exhaustion, depth perception, whatever. But standing there in the dark, it didn't feel like that. It felt like something had been walking in the woods with us. I've spent plenty of nights wandering for the woods and pastures on my family's farm, and I've heard strange things over the years. But the weirdest experience happened to me one of the nights when my cousins, my sister, and I did what all well-adjusted kids apparently do: go for a walk at midnight. At the far edge of our property is an old family cemetery that's been there for centuries. Most of the gravestones have been worn smooth by time, but the newest date can still be made out as 1865. It sits on a hill in the middle of the pasture, marked by huge old oak trees that you can spot in the distance. That night, it was around 1:30 a.m. We were walking when one of my cousins suddenly gasped. Right as we asked what she saw, we all noticed it too. There was a light moving around inside the cemetery. It wasn't bright or harsh like a flashlight. It looked exactly like an old kerosene lantern, warm and steady, moving around as if someone was walking through the graves carrying it. The creepy part was nobody lives anywhere near that side of the property. There's nothing out there for miles. We stopped about a quarter mile away and stared. For a couple minutes we watched the light moving around and tried to come up with some explanation. Then, without warning, it completely went out. Not dimmed, not disappeared behind something. It was just gone. That was enough for us. We turned around and headed back. There's probably a normal explanation for it. Someone's out there, weird lighting, something reflecting. But standing in a dark pasture at 1:30 a.m., watching what looked like a lantern moving through a cemetery from the 1800s, definitely left an impression. It's definitely easy to hear strange things when you're outside, and I know I can see why some experiences would have felt unsettling. I actually just got back from spending a few days in the mountains. where I knew I was completely alone. There had been heavy rain, strong winds, and a lot of water movement from melting snow. The first night I was convinced I heard music. Not live music, more like something playing a radio somewhere in the distance. I was fully awake, so I know I wasn't dreaming. After listening for a while, I eventually figured out it was probably the sound of water. It must have been creating tones or echoes I'm not used to hearing. But at the same time, it sounded incredibly convincing. My brother had a similar experience while hiking and winter camping with a friend in the mountains. More than a full day's travel from anyone else. In the middle of the night, he woke up to what sounded exactly like footsteps outside of his tent. After thinking about it, they figured it was likely the wind moving through the tracks that they had made while setting up camp earlier that day. Probably a normal explanation, but when you're out in the wilderness and hear something sounds unmistakably human, it can feel pretty eerie in the moment. One time I went on an overnight hike with my family into a designated wilderness area in California. We were the only vehicle at the trailhead, and we didn't see another person the entire trip. I usually have trouble falling asleep, so that night I was lying awake in my sleeping bag listening to the normal sounds of being outside. Then I started to hear something strange. It sounded like distant moving, almost like someone groaning in pain. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct enough that I kept listening for a while. Eventually, I convinced myself it was probably my imagination or some weird sound carrying through the area and finally drifted off to sleep. The next morning I mentioned it to my family. That's when my youngest son, who was a senior in high school at the time, casually said he heard it too. Still have no idea what it was. But considering the entire day had already been one minor disaster after another, it felt pretty fitting to end the way it did. A couple of years ago, I hiked up a rocky overlook in Acadia National Park to shoot the Milky Way. Everything about the night was perfect. Clear weather, great conditions, good photos. Exactly the kind of night you hope for. I was wrapping up and waiting for my final set of long exposures to finish, when completely out of nowhere, the entire rocky area around me lit up green. It startled me enough that I immediately spun around expecting to see another hiker with a green headlamp, or maybe someone coming at the end of the trail. But there was nothing. I know for a fact that I was alone the whole time. Instead, about 20 feet in front of me, I saw this green streak of light slowly descending through the air. Not like a meteor, not an aurora, and it certainly wasn't an animal. It looked strangely close, almost at my level, and seemed suspended for a second as it drifted downwards. The closest thing I can compare it to is glowing bits of ash that float down after the fireworks explode. Except there was no boom. I briefly wondered if it was a flare from another hiker, but again, no sound and there was no people around. The whole thing lasted maybe 2 seconds before disappearing. That was enough for me. I picked up immediately and packed my things and power walked down the trail with music playing from my phone because suddenly I cared a lot less about preserving night vision and a lot more about not feeling alone. Back at camp, I remembered something. My camera had been running a long exposure at the time, so I checked the image. The actual streak had appeared behind me, so it wasn't visible in the frame, but the green glow it cast absolutely showed up in the photo, which at least confirmed I didn't imagine it. Still, I have to wonder what caused it. weird atmospheric event, some sort of airborne reflection. Whatever it was, I've never seen anything like it on any other night hike I've had since. Last year, I was on sort of a last hurrah camping trip in the fall before it got too cold and snowy for my current gear setup. I was heading solo into the valley and figured I'd probably have the place to myself since it was late in the season. I'd also planned to bushwhack and scramble for a couple of alpine lakes I'd spotted on my map. It was about 3 clicks from where I had planned to camp. On the way in, I got a little ambitious and added some side trips, so I ended up reaching camp much later than expected. I was alone. I knew daylight was running out, and the valley occasionally had grizzly warnings. So I set up camp quickly and headed off back into the woods at a pretty fast pace. There was a faint trail at first, but eventually I was fully off trail, making my way through the forest towards the climb up towards the lakes. As I walked, I kept calling out, "Hey ho!" every so often to avoid surprising bears. About a kilometer from the lake, I suddenly heard, "Hey ho!" a woman's voice. It sounded loud and incredibly close, like she was right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. I stood there waiting, expecting someone to step out from the trees, but no one ever did. I kept going, ended up towards the lakes. Once I reached the higher ground, I looked down across the forest, expecting to spot another hiker. Still, I didn't see anything. I didn't stay at the lake long, partly because it was growing darker, but mostly because the whole thing fairly unsettled me. I pretty much speed walked back to camp and made it before the full-on dark. Thankfully, a few other campers arrived later in the evening. I asked one of them if they had seen anyone else early in the woods. None of them had. They also hadn't passed anyone coming in, and the part of the route into the valley follows a ridge where you'd almost certainly see other hikers if they were there. To get into that section of the valley, someone would have had to either pass directly through the campsite or cross some pretty serious mountain terrain. And that's what sticks with me to this day. Someone or something seemed to answer me in the middle of nowhere. And if that really was a person, they somehow got back out in complete darkness without me ever seeing them. This happened many years ago, when I was about 16. I live in New Zealand, and growing up, my family went camping every summer. One summer, we stayed at a beach campground at the end of a peninsula. The campground sat at the end of a long beach, and on the opposite end, there was a headland with an old pa site on it, one of the traditional terraced Maori fortified villages built into the hillsides. The whole thing felt pretty wild and remote, and most people stayed close to the campsite side of the beach. One of the things I loved to do was go off on long hikes by myself every afternoon. One day I decided to explore around the headland and see what was on the other side. It was mostly an easy scramble over rocks with a few awkward sections. I'd gone part way before the previous trips, but this time I was going to go much further. Eventually, I came around to this tiny hidden beach tucked away between rocky points. There was nobody there. It was completely deserted. By then, it was getting later in the afternoon, and I knew the tide had turned and was starting to come in. If I'd stayed too long, I'd end up trapped on the rocks. So I walked to the other end of the little beach and stopped to look over the ocean. Everything was incredibly quiet. It was just the surf and the wind. Then all at once, I got this overwhelming feeling that someone was standing directly behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The bluff above me towered overhead, and from where I stood, you could see the old paw site. And suddenly, I got this intense feeling that I shouldn't be there. Not fear exactly, more like I was intruding somewhere I wasn't welcome. I turned back towards the ocean, and instantly the feeling got stronger. This time I was absolutely convinced someone was standing right behind me. Goosebumps just exploded all over my body. I kept turning around and trying to catch whoever was there, but there was nobody. But then my heart was pounding, and I was genuinely scared. So I decided I was done and headed back the way I had come. About halfway across the little beach, something happened that I still can't explain. I felt a pressure on my shoulder blades. Not enough to knock me or make me unstable, more like someone had placed a hand there and was guiding me forward. Like I was being encouraged to keep moving. By that point, I was sweating, shaking, and actually said out loud, I'm going. The second I climbed back onto the rocks and started retracing my route, the feeling disappeared. It just completely vanished. I calmed down almost immediately. Later back at the camp, the ranger was chatting with my dad. Dad asked where I'd been, and I told him. The ranger looked for me for a second and said, You're brave. I laughed and said something like, It's really creepy around that little beach past the headlands. He kind of smiled and said, Yes, it certainly is. Then we exchanged a look. Nothing dramatic, but it felt like he knew exactly what I meant. I'm not especially spiritual, and I'm usually pretty skeptical about things, but whatever feeling that was, I've never gone back to that beach, and I don't plan to. I used to hike with my dad all the time. We got to the point where a normal day hike for us was about 20 miles, and a long one could be 30. This particular hike was around somewhere in the low 20-mile range. On the way out, we made a stupid mistake. We forgot our Camelback and only bought 2 large water bottles. We rationed as much as we could, but we still ran out around the 12 miles left in the hike to reach the trailhead. Once we were out of water, our pace dropped hard. As the terrain opened from the mountain into more of a valley, we started losing the trail repeatedly. Looking back, we were probably much more dehydrated than we realized, exhausted, foggy, and even dizzy. Eventually, my dad sat down for a bit to get his bearings. I told him I'd walk in a straight line for about 10 minutes and try to locate the trail and then come back. That was the first and only time in my life I've actually felt scared in the mountains. After walking for a while, I came across a kid. He looked like a Boy Scout, but not in modern, old-style uniform. He was in a modern, not in a modern, but old-style uniform. He looked at me and said he knew where the trail was, so I followed him. After a little while, I heard another voice. Up ahead, there was this adult man dressed the same way. Old Boy Scout uniform, huge mustache, covered in badges and medals, heavy set, big beard, extremely friendly. I asked if this was the way back to the trail. He smiled and said yes. At the time, I started yelling for my dad because I was terrified that if I left these people, I'd never find my way again. Eventually, my dad found us, and I told him I found the trail. The 2 scout-looking people led us for what felt like another hour, through brush, fields, and through rough terrain. Then suddenly the man stopped and said, "And here it is." Right in front of us, an old proper dirt trail, stone-lined edges, small wooden bridge. I turned and yelled, "Dad, we found it! Thank you so..." And then I stopped. Nobody was there. Both of them were gone. There was no movement for the trees. There's no figures walking away. Nothing. I checked the ground, looked behind us, and looked for the bush. The only footprints I found were ours. Maybe I was dehydrated. That would honestly make more sense than anything else. Maybe I was hallucinating. That leaves one question I've never been able to answer. How did we get back? For reference, this wasn't some obvious stream I unconsciously followed. Just one tiny trickle that wouldn't have led anywhere. We basically cut through the mountains and open country and somehow ended up exactly where we needed to be. This was in Yosemite National Park. My dad grew up around there. We hiked the area constantly. If dehydration hadn't been involved, I would have never believed we would have ever gotten lost. And even now, I still don't know what to make of it. Not trying to tell a campfire story, but I cannot believe that this happened to us.